Thank you for everyone for being here today. I want to recognize also Adam Kokesh of Iraq Veterans Against the War is here. It's been invaluable help to me over the last few years, and also thank Eric and everyone here at IPS, not only for inviting me to speak here today, but also for publishing my work the last few years and giving my work an outlet on a regular basis and publishing opinions that are not always the most popular but need to be heard. As Eric mentioned, I was in Iraq as a journalist on and off from the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003 until February of 2005. I reported all over Iraq, in many of the hot zones, as well as in Kurdistan and northern Iraq, where the situation is more peaceful. And I was there as an unembedded journalist, which meant that I was reporting the stories of the Iraqi people and how they were affected by America's bombing campaigns and house-to-house searches and their experiences in Abu Ghraib prison and other things like that. And I didn't really get to talk to the American soldiers when I was over there because there's a war going on, and the American soldiers had guns, and I was on the other side of those guns. And so the safest thing for me to do was to stay as far away from them as possible, because wherever they went, that's where the war was. People would attack them, they would attack back. Much safer to go in after that battle and talk to the civilians who were there and get their firsthand testimonies. So it really wasn't until after I got home that I began to connect with American soldiers. And the way that ended up happening was through my writing of my first book, How America Lost Iraq. I toured around the country with it. I did a lot of radio interviews around the country as well. And what I noticed was when I would go and do these speaking engagements, most of the questions would be relatively uninformed from the audience. A lot of people would just want to talk at me, and that would be very frustrating to me as somebody who'd just gotten back from the war zone. But the one group of people that had really good questions and had equally valid experiences to share with me as I had to share with them were the veterans. And I was really interested in what they had to say because they were sharing a perspective about the war that I wasn't able to see as a journalist over there. And one of the things that kept coming up again and again was how alone they felt in this society, just as I felt alone when I came home. When you've just seen somebody dead and sitting in the middle of the road for weeks, and nobody went to bury them because the fighting was too fierce and they're rotting, and finally you see the medical team take them away, and there's a 12-year-old kid on the medical team, and you're wondering, what is this 12-year-old kid's going to be like? What is his life going to be like for the rest of his life, having this informed his youth? And you're wrestling with these issues. Then you come home and everyone wants to know whether you think the iPhone is better or the iTouch, and what do you think about that Britney Spears? She's, her life is sure screwed up, isn't it? And like you try to raise these issues about what you've just seen that's been so important, and nobody really wants to listen. And then beyond that, the tremendous difficulties that people were getting on with their life. I remember speaking in Boston alongside this former Navy lieutenant who had been a spokesperson for the U.S. military during the initial invasion and also done some bombing runs. And he had so much trouble when he came back because when he was stationed on this aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean Ocean, he was lying all the time to the media. He was told what to say from his superiors, and if that happened to not match up with the facts, he had to say it anyway. That was his job. But, when he came home, he finally had the opportunity to sit with that, and he melted down, and he became completely non-functional, and he had 2 kids that he hadn't been able to see for years because he had also been deployed to Afghanistan before he was sent over in the invasion of Iraq, and had been boots on the ground in Afghanistan. Was home, finally got to spend a lot of time with his children, but he couldn't really enjoy it because he was non-functional, and he had to get himself into a residential program at the VA to straighten himself out, and luckily he was on the other end of that, and he was beginning to recover. But I began to hear these stories again and again. And when I would go on late-night talk shows on the radio around the country, the phone lines would fill up with the family members of soldiers who would ask me, what do I do? You know, my son came home from Iraq, but now I can't talk to him anymore. My son came home from Iraq, and now he's drunk all the time. I remember one guy in particular when I was on KOA in Denver at 3 in the morning, you know, calling in and staying on the phone with him for like 45 minutes, getting his story and then giving, you know, some suggestions. And so I began to look around for the reporters who were doing journalism on this, and I found that there wasn't really a lot of reporters doing reporting about this. But when I started to look into it, I couldn't believe that there was so little reporting being done. I mean, just some statistics that are throughout the book. We have 1.8 million veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and 300,000 have already filed a disability claim with the federal government. So 300,000 people have already filed for disability. The RAND Corporation, you know, the military think tank, estimates that 300,000 Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder or major depression, and another 300,000 suffer from traumatic brain injuries as physical brain damage, which is often caused by a roadside bomb or an explosion, a concussion, and because of the multiple tours that our soldiers and Marines are facing in Iraq and Afghanistan, many people are literally being layered with PTSD and TBI. So a lot of people have PTSD and TBI. A lot of people have a traumatic brain injury and then are redeployed again and sustain a second traumatic brain injury, making it much harder to treat later on. And another key finding of RAND is that of the 600,000 people who have post-traumatic stress disorder or traumatic brain injuries, less than half of them are getting any help from the Pentagon or from the Department of Veterans Affairs. According to the Department of Veterans Affairs, 5,000 veterans commit suicide every year. 18 veterans commit suicide every day. 80,000 American soldiers have been medically evacuated from Iraq and Afghanistan. Their casualties have, their injuries have been so big that they couldn't be treated in country. They actually had to be put on a plane and flown to Germany to Landstuhl Medical Center. 300,000 Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans have shown up at the VA for treatment. All of these statistics are public knowledge, but they aren't reported on in the media. And when I say them, nobody ever believes me. I usually have to go through and, you know, cite all of my sources, you know, as they are in the book, but just in conversation, because these numbers are so much higher than what anybody imagines. But they are the government's own statistics. So the other problem is that because people are not aware of the scope of the problem, and because the President of the United States led us to war on false pretenses, we now are doing an extremely poor job of caring for folks who come home. And when I began researching the book, you know, I had this title, The War Comes Home, but I didn't have a subtitle for the book. But the longer I reported, the more it became clear to me that the subtitle needed to be Washington's Battle Against America's Veterans. So the book is The War Comes Home, Washington's Battle Against America's Veterans, because if you come home and you're wounded, you have to battle for each and every one of those benefits that they promised to you when you join the service. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why the situation is so dire right now. Then I'm going to talk a little bit politically why it's so dire right now. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the battle that wounded soldiers have to have with the Pentagon. And finally, I'm going to talk about the battle that wounded veterans have to have with the Department of Veterans Affairs. Then I'll talk a little bit about some efforts that are being taken to deal with this. As I said, George Bush deceived us into this war, and one of the deceptions was that this war would not have any casualties. You may remember that it was supposed to be a cakewalk. You may remember that Donald Rumsfeld said the war would be over in weeks rather than months. They didn't tell us that we would be at war in Iraq 6 years later, or that we would have 1.8 million American soldiers who would be involved in this war over time. And part of that deception was that when people in the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Pentagon went to President Bush and those in his inner circle and told him that you need to hire more doctors at the VA, you need to fire more claims adjusters, you need to fire more psychiatrists at the Pentagon. When these people in government made these requests, they were eliminated. So Anthony Principi was the head of the VA. He went to President Bush and he said, President Bush, we need more doctors and claims adjusters because we are going to have a deluge of Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans, and in the meantime, the population of Vietnam veterans and World War II veterans is getting older and sicker. So we need a bigger, stronger VA to take care of these people that we promised to take care of. So President Bush fired him, and he hired Jim Nicholson to be the head of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Jim Nicholson is a real estate developer from Colorado whose main expertise was being chair of the Republican National Committee in the year 2000 and leading President Bush's efforts in the Florida recount. So he took out the professional who had served previously in both Democratic and Republican administrations and replaced him with a political hack who would toe the party line. This rippled all the way down. In 2006, Dr. Francis Murphy, who had been hired to develop a mental health plan for the VA, had the temerity to say that mental health was so unavailable as to render it worthless. In other words, although the people who worked at the VA were excellent doctors, there were so many barriers put up to people actually seeing them that it was like they weren't there at all. She was also fired. I could go down the list. Retired Admiral Daniel Cooper, who was in charge of benefits for the VA, he organized evangelical prayer meetings in his office, and he promoted people at the Department of Veterans Affairs Benefits Office not on whether or not they were doing a good job in getting benefits to disabled soldiers, but on the basis of whether or not they attended his evangelical prayer sessions. And he taped a video for an organization here in Washington where he said in the promotional video, my weekly Bible study sessions are more important than doing my job. Thankfully, he's recently been forced to resign after doing a lot of damage. So that's on the political side and the particular things that President Bush did to make sure that people did not realize that there were going to be casualties and therefore failed to prepare to treat the wounded. But there are also problems that are long-standing, and the very system at the VA it goes back generations to the Vietnam War and even before to the Korean War veterans who were also betrayed, and even to veterans of World War I who had to march on Washington and actually were attacked by the U.S. military on the Capitol Mall when they went in to get their disability benefits and their bonus checks after World War I. But actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. I was supposed to talk about the Pentagon and how you have to battle the Pentagon first, because even when you're still in the military, you have to battle the Pentagon for medical treatment. People probably know about the scandal at Walter Reed. It's broken in the Washington Post, the fact that there are people basically being warehoused at a hospital with black mold on the walls and rat droppings just 5 miles away from the White House caused quite a stir here in the District of Columbia and across the country. But most people don't realize is that Walter Reed is just one hospital. There are military facilities all over the country, and one of the biggest problems is even trying to get into them, because the war has gone on for so long and the Pentagon is so desperate for men that they deploy people to Iraq who should be in these facilities to begin with. And so we have many, many people who have served 1, 2, 3, or 4 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan who have sustained multiple traumatic brain injuries or been layered with multiple levels of PTSD. And rather than getting the care they need, they get shipped off to Iraq again. And sometimes this can have terrible results. When people get out of the military, they have to have a second battle. They have to battle with the Department of Veterans Affairs. We don't have time to go through an exhaustive description of all the things that you have to battle with about the VA, so I'm going to stick to just talking for a little bit about the battle that you have to take to get your disability benefits. if you are wounded from Iraq or Afghanistan or any war, you have to prove to them that you're wounded before you can get a check. You have to, if you have post-traumatic stress disorder, you have to fill out a 26-page form where you describe how you got PTSD, what the incident was. You have to get the records of your other people that you served with. You have to get your military records. You have to document that the incidents actually occurred. Then you file the paperwork off to the VA. And you have to go in for exams as well and various things. And in the best case scenario, it takes between 6 and 8 months to get your claim approved. And sometimes, if your claim is initially denied, this battle can go on for years. And the situation is so dysfunctional that we currently have 600,000 Americans waiting in line to see if they are going to get a disability check from the Department of Veterans Affairs. The system is so broken that in the last 6 months, 1,500 American veterans died waiting to find out if they were going to get a disability check from the VA. Since we don't have a lot of time, I won't read again, but I want to tell you the story of James Eggemeyer of Stuart, Florida. He served during the first year of the war in Iraq. He drove convoys up and down the main highway going from Baghdad to Kuwait, and he threw out his back. And he came back also with post-traumatic stress disorder because he, when they would get in a convoy accident, he would load the bodies of the dead and wounded Iraqis into Black Hawk helicopters that would arrive on the scene. And when he came back, he initially tried to make a go of it. He moved back to Stuart, Florida. He got a job at a car wash where he was washing the cars of relatively rich people who went to a golf course that was nearby. And he was having a tough time there. He wasn't really cut out for this kind of physical labor of washing cars because he had thrown out his back. And in addition to that, he was having trouble socializing with the other people at work, and he ended up quitting his job and deciding that he wanted to file a claim for disability with the VA. While he was waiting to find out if he was going to be getting this disability check, he lost his house. He could no longer live with his daughter because he had to move into his truck, because he was medicating himself, because he could not get access to the VA's medical system. He crashed his truck. And then, luckily, there were community groups that stepped forward and bought him a new used truck that he could sleep in and helped him with his claim. Because 8 months later, he did win his claim. He got 100% disability, and he was able to move into a trailer park. And it's not like people say, like, we have to make them prove that they really are entitled to these benefits, or else they'll game the system. If you win your disability claim at 100%, you have enough money to move into a trailer park. But that was a lot better than living on the street. Now he's finally recovering, getting to know his son again, and well on the way to meaningful employment, which is a happy story, and it just shows that if we didn't make people carry on this battle, that they would be able to win in their own lives. When we file our taxes with the IRS, we fill out the forms. We tell them how much money we owe them, or if they owe us a refund. And they believe us. They send us our refund check. And then later on, they audit us. And if it turns out we lied, they fine us or even, send us to prison or worse. But we don't trust our veterans. I mean, basically what I'm saying is that our IRS bureaucracy is a lot nicer than our VA bureaucracy. And this kind of hostility, again, getting back to the beginning, about towards our veterans when they come home, I think is very tied into our country's inability to grapple with what a war is about. We don't hire enough doctors because we want to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel good about a war being a wonderful, victorious, incredibly great thing that we can wave our flag about. And in this way, veterans are an unpleasant reminder of the mistakes that we've made, and we just kind of want to sweep them under the rug when they come home. And that's something that actually really worries me going forward. You know, I'm very optimistic about the election of President-elect Barack Obama. It's certainly going to be a nice change after 8 years of George Bush. I think that the war hopefully will begin to wind down. But I'm worried about the mood in this country because, as you may have noticed, Iraq has disappeared from the front page. It's only about 1 or 2% of the news now, according to major surveys by the Pew Center and others. And people in America just want to forget about the war. They want it to be over with, and they want to forget about it. But for the veterans who served our country in this war, and for the Iraqi civilians who still live in Iraq every single day, the story is just beginning. The story will continue for the rest of their lives. And we have to be there for them and for each other over the long haul. Thank you very much.